Hi students and teachers. Depending on what part of the week you're watching this video, it is either about to be the season of Lent or it already is the season of Lent. Lent is a time in the Christian year that begins on Ash Wednesday, which is this week, February 17th, and it ends on Easter Sunday, which will be April the 4th. If you've been a student here at Evangelical in previous school years, you will hopefully remember that when there's not a global pandemic, we gather in the sanctuary on Ash Wednesday, and we have ashes placed on our forehead in the shape of a cross by either me or Pastor Jerry. That's how the season of Lent begins, and the purpose of this season is to help prepare our hearts and our minds for Easter. We anticipate the time in which God's rescue plan through Jesus comes to its biggest moments, his death and his resurrection. Now, in here, for religion class, we have spent time talking about Jesus' parables, his miracles, how he prayed. Now we're going to spend the season of Lent talking about 6 of the most important things he said. Now, I didn't say the most important things Jesus said because people might disagree on what exactly those 6 would be. But for me, in my years of studying the Gospels, these are some of the things I would consider to be essential lessons from his teachings if we are to truly understand Jesus. So, in no particular order, we will start today on that list of 6 with love your enemies. This is a great week to talk about love because we just celebrated Valentine's Day. Now, if you're familiar with the church tradition of saints, it's actually Saint Valentine's Day because it's honoring a saint named Valentine. Valentine did, in the 3rd century, so like the years that are the 200s. He was either a priest or a bishop in the Roman Empire, and he was known for ministering to persecuted Christians. But of course, now we associate his holiday with romantic love or with love or kindness in any form, really. You enjoy giving and receiving Valentines with your classmates and your friends. Sometimes you exchange gifts with your family members as well. Gestures of love to those we appreciate are great. But Jesus in this lesson is going to challenge us to go even further than that and extend love to our enemies. There's a series of chapters in the Gospel of Matthew called the Sermon on the Mount. It's fairly similar to a shorter passage in Luke called the Sermon on the Plain. Now that doesn't mean an airplane in the sky. That means a plain, like a flat piece of ground. So either the Sermon on the Plain or the Sermon on the Mount. So on the Mount in Matthew is the longer version, and it includes the Lord's Prayer, which we covered last week, and a poetic section called the Beatitudes, where he says things like, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Here's a great video clip to tell you a little bit more about the Sermon on the Mount.
God's story, the Sermon on the Mount. So part of God's story is about a sermon Jesus gave on the side of a mountain and what he did afterwards. And it goes like this. One day, when Jesus saw crowds gathering to hear him teach or see him do miracles, he went to the side of a mountain. It was near the Sea of Galilee, across from a place called Capernaum. From there, he gave a message all about God's kingdom and his love. We call this message the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus started by explaining who would get blessings or favor from God. He said the most blessed people are those who are poor, sad, or humble. He said God shows favor to people who are just or treat others fairly, and people who are merciful or show love to those who don't deserve it. He said the people who are pure, who bring peace, or who get hurt for doing right will be rewarded for their actions in heaven. In other words, the people who love others, even when it makes them seem weak or unimportant on earth, are like heroes in God's kingdom. Anyway, Jesus went on to explain that when we believe in and follow him, it's our job to show everyone else who he is by loving them. That means going out of our way not only to comfort and help our friends, but also forgive people who hurt us, love our enemies, and give to people in need. The thing is, Jesus didn't just talk about love, he showed it all the time. In fact, right after giving this sermon, Jesus spent the rest of the day helping everyone he met. First, as Jesus came down from the mountain, a man with a skin disease called leprosy knelt before him. "Lord," the man said, "if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean." Usually, no one wanted to be around people with leprosy, but Jesus touched him and said, "I am willing, be healed." Instantly, the leprosy disappeared. Then, when Jesus arrived in Capernaum a bit later, a soldier said to him, "Lord, my servant is in terrible pain." Right away, Jesus said, "I will come and heal him." The officer said, "Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed." Jesus told him, "Because you believed, it has happened." The officer's servant was healed. Jesus taught a lot of people how to love and showed them what love looks like. Whenever somebody took their sickness or pain or fear to Jesus, he helped them. Everybody who met Jesus got to experience his love. And when we love like Jesus, everyone who meets us can feel his love too. And that's the story of the Sermon on the Mount.
I love how this video shows the connection between what Jesus said and what Jesus did. He didn't just tell us to love others, he showed us how to love them by going out, as you saw in the video, among the people immediately after speaking this message. If you read through the Sermon on the Mount, you'll notice that Jesus has a pattern of taking what they have been taught already and giving them a completely different way of looking at it. He would start with saying, "You have heard that it was said to do this, but I tell you to do this instead." He does this twice in the part that we're going to focus on. First he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person." Then a few verses later he says, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Here's another clip. This is from one of the classic Jesus films that shows us this full passage that I'm referring to and how it may or may not have been received well by the people hearing it.
"But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. And pray for those who mistreat you." If anyone strikes you on the one cheek, let him hit the other one also. And if someone takes away your coat, let him have your shirt as well. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if someone takes what is yours, do not ask for it back again. Do for others only what you would have others do for you. If you love only the people who love you, why should you receive a blessing? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, why should you receive a blessing? Even sinners do that.
How could he touch her? How could he talk to her?
Disgusting.
No. Love your enemies and do good to them and lend expecting nothing back. And then you will have a great reward, for you will be sons of the Most High God. For he is good to the ungrateful and to the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful.
So as you can see, at least some of the people didn't like what they were hearing Jesus say. They were disgusted when they saw Jesus touch the woman they considered to be a sinner. The only way they had been taught before this to deal with people like that was to shun them, to push them away, to have nothing to do with them. Jesus was trying to show them here a better way. It wasn't an easy way, though. But he challenges us just the same to make that harder choice. He says it's easy to just love the people who love you back. Even the sinners do that. It's easy to do good to the people who do good to you. It's so much easier to hate an enemy. That comes naturally. We want revenge for the bad things that they've done to us. But loving them means showing them mercy. And mercy requires us to give up revenge, to hand that part, that judgment, over to God. Loving our enemies doesn't mean allowing them to continue to hurt us. I want to make sure you hear that. Loving our enemies doesn't mean allowing them to continue to hurt us. We can do what is in our control to protect ourselves while trusting God to step in for his part. I like that the writers of this film, from this clip, wove in the golden rule to this lesson. The way Jesus says it here is, do for others only what you would have others do for you. Or in other words, treat other people well because you would want them to treat you well. Would you like to be pushed away, left out, shown hatred? Of course not. Would you like to be shown love? Yes, certainly. I'd like you to think now about who Jesus is referring to here. Who are our enemies? If we're supposed to love them, we should probably figure out who they are. So I'd like you to discuss this as a class. Who would you say are our enemies? Give examples of the kind of people maybe that you think of when you hear Jesus talking here about enemies. Go ahead and pause the video, talk about it, and I'll see you again in a few minutes. Let me go ahead and say thank you once again to our kindergartners for my lovely art here that I hope you all are enjoying. This, of course, is from when Jesus fed the multitudes with the little boy's lunch, which we covered a few weeks ago. I hope you came up with some great answers. It's easy to define our enemies when maybe we're watching TV or playing with toys or video games. It's usually clear who the good guys and the bad guys are. There's heroes like Luke Skywalker or Batman, and there's villains like Darth Vader or the Joker. In real life, too, it's a little easier to define our enemies if we're at war. If this was World War II, we would say our enemies, confidently, are the Nazis. Or if this was 9/11, we would, with confidence, say that our enemies are the terrorists who attacked us on U.S. soil. It's certainly a challenge to love those kinds of people, people who are actively harming us or trying to harm us. But I think Jesus is speaking even beyond just villains or military enemies. I think for us to fully grasp what he's talking about here, we need to think of it in our terms. What happens in our lives? Who do we perceive to be our enemies? Is it the neighborhood kid who bullies you? Is it the classmate who argues with you or calls you names? Is it the quiet kid who always seems to be off by themselves? Is it the person who always seems to do better than you at sports or makes better grades than you do? Maybe it's the person who disagrees with you about politics, or maybe it's the person who tells you they don't believe in God. Now, these aren't necessarily enemies in the traditional sense. Yes, if someone bullies you, certainly, or calls you names, they're making very bad choices, and something should be done about that. But most of those other examples I just described are only differences. They're not necessarily good or bad things, just things that are different from you, people who are different from you. You see, there's all kinds of ways we as humans try to make someone else into an enemy just because we perceive them to be different than we are. We look down on other people, for example, because they don't have as much money as we do, or because their skin is a different color than ours, or because they believe in a different religion or no religion at all. Or maybe they live in a different country and speak a different language, and we don't try to understand or bridge those gaps between the ways we are and the ways they are. We create enemies by thinking the worst about other people instead of trying to understand them. Right now, for example, our nation is terribly divided about politics. Maybe even you in your classrooms are terribly divided about politics. Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, and all the various people in the middle. People on the left see those on the right as their enemy. People on the right see people on the left as their enemy. There have been differences of opinions about politics since our nation began. But it gets so much worse when you think the people who disagree with you are evil people. I fear that we've gone so far that we've made enemies out of each other, when in reality we should be attempting to understand each other even when we disagree. Loving our enemies, however we choose to define enemy, starts with seeing them as human beings in need of God's grace, just like we are. Jesus doesn't say to love the bad things they're doing. I need you to understand that. Let me say it again. Jesus doesn't say to love the bad things they are doing. He just wants you to love them as people. He wants you to try to see them as God sees them. Now, in their time, Jesus' Jewish followers would have seen their Roman oppressors as their enemy. And if you noticed in the earlier video clip, that animated one, Jesus is approached by a Roman soldier, and he's asked to heal that soldier's servant. Now, Jesus didn't push the soldier away and say, "No, you're Roman, you're my enemy." No, he showed him love, and he did what that person kindly asked him to do. Toward the end of his life, we'll see this again when Jesus takes time to pray for the people who have arrested him, who have beaten him, who have hung him on a cross. He says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Can you imagine taking time to pray for people who are literally beating you? Jesus wasn't just telling us how to love our enemies. He was showing us how to love our enemies. He was showing us that love isn't just about a feeling, that it's also about an action. Love is a verb at times. It is something that we should do, not just something we should talk about or feel. When we show love to our enemies, it's not a statement about the kinds of things they are doing. No, it's a statement about the kinds of things we are doing, the kinds of things we can do. We didn't choose for them to be the way they are, but we can choose to be the way we are. The way we respond to others says everything about our character. Jesus wants us to have so much love in our hearts that there's no room left in our hearts for hate. And maybe that love inside of us will be so powerful that it transforms enemies into friends. The people in Jesus' day believed in an eye for an eye. That basically means that if someone does something bad to you, then you should go and do the exact same thing back to them. If someone pokes your eye out, then you should go and poke their eye out. If someone steals something from you, you should steal something from them. And even to this day, a lot of people feel like that's the most fair way to respond to something that happens to them. But Jesus wants us to see that an eye for an eye just makes the whole world blind. Or if you've ever heard it this way, you fight fire with fire and you're just going to get a bigger fire. A great example of this is when Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders during the civil rights movement would organize peaceful protests. When racists would respond to them with violence, they would not fight back. And that response of peace helped others see who was right and who was wrong in that situation. Their efforts truly changed people's hearts and minds and helped them to see African Americans as people created in God's image, just like they were. People who should be treated fairly and given the same rights as everyone else. To close things out, I want you to examine your own hearts and see if there is any hatred there. Pray that God then will help you overcome that hatred and replace it with love. And in examining your heart, think also about this question. Ask yourself, would someone else consider me to be their enemy? Is there anything that you've done to someone else that you shouldn't have done? Something that might have really hurt them or made them feel like hating you? If so, then it's a great idea to first admit that. And then also to seek forgiveness. Forgiveness from God and forgiveness from the people you have hurt. As I said before, love can transform enemies into friends. I'll see you next time.